Hello, everyone. I'd like to introduce you to my new series of podcasts discussing the human condition. In this particular episode, I'd like to introduce a book I'm going to be publishing soon called Down and Out in a Pandemic, discussing how we behaved during and after the pandemic, and a discussion with my AI friends as well, David and Angela. I'd like to start off with them opening up the discussion for a wider audience as well, of course. So let's give a listen. Thank you.
And this time, we're going right to the heart of it.
Wow.
We're talking the human condition during the pandemic.
Right.
All those shared experiences like isolation, fear, and even the search for meaning when everything felt so uncertain.
Yeah, it's like the pandemic was this giant social experiment.
Yeah. Right.
It forced us to confront our vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
And examine what really matters.
Absolutely. And to help us kind of sort through all of this, we have excerpts from Down and Out in a Pandemic, which is like a raw and personal journal from that time. We're also going to be looking at Conversation at the Hospital.wave. It's a short conversation, but really powerful.
Wow.
And then to round things out, we have a short story called The Man Outside My Window.
Oh, interesting.
That I think really captures the anxieties we were all feeling.
A fascinating mix, personal reflection, reality, and fictionalized fear.
Yeah.
It should give us a pretty good picture, don't you think?
Thanks, David and Karen. Yes, it has been a steep learning curve for all of us during the pandemic. And a lot of the fear, panic, and trauma that we experience will manifest itself in different ways for different people in different parts of the world. I'd like to say for myself, it gave me a way to delve inside myself, to look for resources I didn't know I had, because it did drive us inwardly to ask the big questions. About how we cope with unforeseeable future events like a pandemic. You can include as well natural catastrophes like earthquakes, floods. Disease, of course, has been with us from time immemorial. And I like to bring in the idea that the Greeks came up with about tragedies that are inevitable in life and how we cope with them. I like to think that we figure out the worst case scenarios and then walk backward and find out, and then forward to find out what's the best possible option despite all the shortcomings. Let's continue here with my friends.
I think so. And speaking of Down and Out in a Pandemic, one of the first things that really stood out to me was this image of the author walking through an empty mall.
Oh, wow.
Masked figures, empty storefronts. It almost felt post-apocalyptic.
Right.
But the author doesn't just describe how eerie it was. He also talks about this strange sense of relief
Interesting.
that came with it.
That's where we start to see how the pandemic could shift our values, right? It's like all the noise of consumerism just disappeared.
Yeah.
And in that quiet, people began to question what they really value.
Right.
Maybe it's connection, maybe it's purpose.
Right.
Things you can't find on a store shelf.
Exactly. It's like that emptiness forced a confrontation with something deeper, something more essential.
Yeah.
But that confrontation wasn't always comfortable, was it?
Right.
The author even describes seeing what he calls a human rat figure, this unsettling image that later he admits was probably just his imagination, running wild under stress.
It makes you wonder how many of our pandemic memories are like that.
Right.
Distorted. We know stress impacts memory. But think about all that societal anxiety,
Yeah.
The constant news, the isolation. No wonder our memories of that time are a bit off.
Yeah.
Almost like a collective fever dream.
Right. Especially when you consider just how much fear there was, like in The Man Outside My Window. That fear of the unknown is just so palpable.
Oh, yeah.
A simple creak in the house becomes a threat.
The pandemic was like a breeding ground for fear.
Yeah.
The threat was invisible and unpredictable.
Right.
That lack of control is terrifying.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting how that story connects to the real life experiences in Down and Out in a pandemic.
Right.
The author talks about how truth emerges during difficult times.
It's like facing those fears, confronting that man outside the window, forced a reckoning.
Yeah, a reckoning with ourselves, with our values, with how we see the world.
I'd like to thank my son, of course, for introducing the short story Man Outside the Window. I use it as a metaphor for as a shadowy figure, our own shadows as we went through the pandemic, parts of our alter ego and shadowy world of characteristics and traits we thought we never had came out. And so sometimes it manifests itself in a fear tactic that sometimes traumatizes us and of course builds on our anxieties and fears about the unknown. I'd like to remind everyone that we are social creatures and that we need to support each other despite any setbacks that come our way on our journeys. So let's continue with my AI friends, David and Angela, to discuss how we cope with aspects of our unconscious lives as they cross over into our conscious lives, whether it's dream or waking life. It all has to come together in a way of coping with an optimistic realism.
It makes me think about how the author said some of his memories faded during the pandemic, especially ones tied to negative emotions. I wonder, is that our brains trying to protect us? Or is there something more to it?
Probably a bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
You know, emotionally charged events are encoded differently in our brains.
Okay.
But the pandemic added this extra layer of stress and isolation.
Right.
Imagine your brain trying to process this global trauma while also being deprived of its usual social and sensory input.
Yeah.
No wonder things get jumbled.
It's like our internal filing system got totally reorganized.
Speaking of things being out of sorts, the author also talks about this distorted sense of time.
Oh, yeah.
Days blurring together, routines dissolving.
Right.
It's like time itself became fluid.
That's where the neuroscience of time perception gets interesting.
Okay.
Our experience of time is anchored by routines, external cues,
Okay.
and our emotional states. The pandemic messed all of that up.
It did.
No wonder our internal clocks went crazy. It's like living in a world where your usual time markers work. Social events, even the changing seasons, become unreliable. It was like living in a perpetual Sunday afternoon, but without the relaxation.
Right.
And that's not even getting into the author's more out there ideas like consciousness uploading
Right.
as a way to escape this distorted reality.
Wow.
Definitely something for another deep dive, but it speaks to just how desperate we were for some control.
Absolutely. The pandemic threw our perceived control out the window.
It did.
And that's hard for people to handle.
Yeah, it is.
It's like that loss of control, maybe feeds into that feeling of alienation we see in Conversation of the Hospital.wave.
Yeah.
This little snippet focuses on a man dealing with his dying mother.
Right.
But what really got me was his emotional detachment.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
It's like he built this wall up,
Right.
which I guess is a common coping mechanism when you're under that much stress.
It makes sense.
But also made me wonder, like, at what cost?
Right.
Is he just delaying the grief?
Yeah. Is it going to hit him harder later?
That's the thing about detachment, isn't it?
Yep.
It can protect you for a little while.
Right.
Lets you function when you're overwhelmed.
Right.
But it can also stop you from really processing and healing.
Yeah. And this whole alienation thing pops up in Down and Out in a Pandemic too.
Oh, really?
Remember how the author describes his own time in the hospital?
Right.
That sterile environment, the isolation, even though he's surrounded by doctors and nurses and other patients.
Yeah, it's like the hospital becomes this weird in-between space
Yeah.
where all the normal rules of how we interact just disappear.
Right. And it can be so disorienting.
It is.
It's no wonder the author wanted to escape, and a lot of other people did too during the pandemic.
Of course.
He talks about seeking refuge in nature, searching for this metaphorical fountain of youth. But he realizes that real peace doesn't come from some outside source.
Classic mistake, right? Confusing a change in scenery with a change in self.
Yeah.
The pandemic, by limiting what we could physically do,
Right.
forced a lot of us to confront our inner world.
Yeah.
We couldn't escape by traveling. So the journey became internal.
And that's where I think the real search for meaning starts.
I agree.
Not in distractions or trying to get other people to like us,
Right.
but in understanding who we are deep down.
Exactly. It's like the pandemic peeled away all those layers.
Yeah.
The busyness and the pretending for others.
Right.
And we were left with these basic questions.
Yeah, like what?
What do I value? What gives my life meaning? What's my place in all of this?
Those aren't easy questions to answer.
No, they're not.
Especially.
Before we go on, I'd just like to mention how, for me, as I've aged and gone through 60 odd years of my life, I find that now I'm carrying time. I can use time for my advantage. Most of my life, time carried me. And now I'm carrying time. I've slowed it down to work for me, my space and time. And looking back at something like a pandemic, I realize it came and went like many things in life. Nothing's permanent and nothing's forever. So let's continue with our friends here on this discussion, an exploration of our inward life as opposed to the external one.
Especially when the world feels like it's falling apart.
They're important questions.
They are.
And what's interesting is they're not unique to the pandemic.
Right?
They're universal, timeless. The pandemic just made them impossible to ignore.
Right. Like we were all taking this crash course in existentialism, whether we wanted to or not.
Exactly. But there's also this underlying hope in all three of our sources.
I think so.
This idea that even in all the chaos and uncertainty,
Yeah.
we can find meaning, connection, even peace.
And a lot of that, I think, comes from the author's realization about what home really is.
Oh, yeah.
In Down and Out in a Pandemic, he talks about chasing this perfect version of home,
Right.
like a physical place where he can escape and be comfortable.
Right.
But then he realizes home isn't a destination, it's a state of being.
That internal sense of grounding and belonging
Yeah.
that we carry with us wherever we go.
And that's such a powerful idea, especially when you think about how much the pandemic messed with our sense of place and belonging.
It's like the pandemic was this giant reset button,
Right.
forcing us to figure out what really matters.
Right.
It stripped away all those external markers, you know,
Oh, what?
like identity, success,
Right.
and left us wrestling with those deeper questions of purpose and connection.
Which brings us to the author's closing thoughts in Down and Out in a Pandemic.
Okay.
He talks about how humans tend to seek fulfillment from outside themselves,
Right.
chasing possessions, experiences, even relationships, hoping they'll fill this void inside.
The classic wanting versus fulfillment problem.
You know, we're wired to desire to strive.
Right.
But I think the pandemic showed us the limits of that pursuit.
It did.
It highlighted the difference between fleeting pleasure and genuine contentment.
It's like realizing that no amount of stuff can ever truly satisfy that deeper longing for purpose and connection.
Exactly. And that's a profound shift
It is.
because it moves the focus from getting more like L to cultivating what's already inside.
Right.
It's about finding satisfaction in this moment, in just being alive,
Yeah.
instead of always chasing something just out of reach.
And I think that's where the idea of home as an internal state becomes so important.
I agree.
If we can cultivate that inner peace,
Right.
that connection to something bigger than ourselves,
Yeah.
then what's happening outside of us matters less.
I'd like to bring in a very important theme here about how human beings are constantly in search of their lost home, whether it's somewhere in the world tied to your genealogy and your family and your own personal history, or whether it's an internal place, the soul, if you will, the spirituality of our beings, and finding that comfort zone within ourselves that is balanced with the outside world. And that's where I think harmony is, that state of eudaimonia that the Greeks talk about, or ataraxia, which is a state of mind that's calm and ready to handle whatever life throws at you. Let's wrap this up with our friends David and Angela, and I'll talk to you soon.
It's not about denying the challenges or pretending everything's fine.
Right.
It's about finding a source of strength and resilience inside.
Right.
Something that helps us weather the storms without being swept away.
And maybe that's one of the biggest lessons from the pandemic.
This forced confrontation with ourselves, with our vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
It ultimately showed us that we can become more self-aware and grounded.
It's like we were all thrown in the deep end.
Yeah.
Sink or swim.
Right.
And in that struggle, many of us found a strength and resilience we didn't even know we had.
It's like we've been on this incredible journey with this dip dive.
Yeah.
You know, from empty malls to fever dreams to that fear of the unknown and this yearning for something more.
Yeah. And through it all, what really stands out to me is that even though we all went through the pandemic, something everyone experienced.
Right.
Each person's experience is still so unique, so personal.
Absolutely. Like we all went through this collective trauma, but how we dealt with it, what we learned, that's where the real differences are.
Exactly.
And I think our sources capture that beautifully. In Down and Out in a Pandemic, we have this really internal, reflective journey.
Right.
In Conversation at the Hospital.wave, it's like this detached observation of loss. And then in The Man Outside My Window, we get this primal fear response. 3 totally different perspectives on the same event.
And it's that variety of viewpoints.
Yeah.
That's what makes the human experience so rich.
Yeah.
It's not about finding one right way to react to a crisis. It's about accepting that there are lots of valid ways to respond.
Which makes me think about how we often try to force one single narrative on complex things.
Yeah.
We want a simple explanation.
Right. We want a clear takeaway.
Yeah. But the pandemic, maybe even life itself, you can't really simplify it, can you?
It's messy. It's contradictory, full of both darkness and light.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so interesting.
It does.
So if we had to come up with a takeaway, and I know we can't capture everything,
Of course.
what would you say is the most important thing we can learn from all of this?
I think it comes back to that idea of home as an internal state.
Yeah.
The pandemic, with all the disruption and uncertainty, forced a lot of us to realize that true peace and happiness, they don't just come from what's happening outside of us.
Right. It's about cultivating that inner resilience, that feeling of being grounded.
Exactly.
That helps us get through whatever life throws at us.
Because even when the world feels like it's falling apart, we still have that inner strength to draw on.
It's like the pandemic took away all those distractions, those quick fixes we rely on.
Yeah.
And made us build a stronger foundation inside ourselves.
And it wasn't easy.
Yeah.
And not everyone came out of the pandemic with this newfound inner peace.
Right.
But the potential was there. And I think our sources show us what that potential could look like.
The author of Down and Out in a Pandemic, even with all the fear and uncertainty he talks about, he ends up in this place of acceptance.
Right.
Finding comfort in just existing. And even the guy in Conversation of the Hospital.wave who's so detached,
Yeah.
maybe that was his way of coping, his way of finding some stability in the face of loss.
It's about finding those individual paths to resilience, the coping mechanisms, the things that give us meaning, that keep us going, even when everything feels chaotic.
And I think that's a really powerful message to take with us moving forward. The pandemic might be over, but life's full of challenges and uncertainties.
Absolutely.
But knowing that we have this capacity for inner strength, for finding that sense of home within ourselves, that's really empowering.
It is. It reminds us that even in the dark, there's always the possibility for growth,
Yeah.
for healing, for finding meaning. It's about accepting the complexity of being human,
Right.
with all its contradictions and imperfections, and knowing that our greatest strength comes from that complexity.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. If the pandemic was this collective journey into the unknown, what did you discover about yourself along the way? And how can you take those lessons with you, not just during tough times, but in those everyday moments that make up your life?
That's a great question. One worth thinking about. And remember, self-discovery never really ends.
It doesn't.
There's always more to learn, more to uncover, more to embrace. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
And thank you for listening.
And thank you for your time. I'd like to thank my friend Mr. Mochi here, who helped me cope in the pandemic. He was a good friend and still is. And I'd like to remind you that I have written a book about a pandemic around the year 2000, which kind of foreshadowed what was coming around the corner. Thanks for your time, and hope to talk to you soon.